It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Sam Corey. How you doing, Tia?
We're doing pretty well. It's a Tuesday.
It is a Tuesday.
We're going to have the show going up on a Tuesday, Sam. What's going on the show today?
Okay, we have so much going up on this Tuesday. The presidential election is less than a month away. How significant is this election to the fate of our democracy? We're going to have award-winning journalist Tim Alberta stop by to talk about that and a panel discussion that he's having at Michigan State University. What's up, Tia?
I know.
Tomorrow at 4:30. It's also the last day of Hispanic Heritage Month, and to celebrate, we're going to speak with someone who has dedicated his career to improving the life of Latino residents here in Southeast Michigan.
I'm really excited about all of the conversations we have on the show today, so let's get it started. If you have a child, you know how expensive childcare can be. It's also very hard to find. But despite that, childcare workers have some of the lowest wages in the country. The median wage is $13 per hour nationally. That is not enough to live on. So why do early childhood educators make so little money despite there being such high demand for childcare?
A new early childhood educator workforce index shows that childcare wages remain low in Michigan specifically and across the U.S. Here to discuss that report is McLean. She is the director of multi-state and international programs at Berkeley's Center for the Study of Childcare Employment. Caitlin, thanks for joining us on the Metro.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Good morning. So, Caitlin, what exactly is childcare work? What defines a childcare worker?
That is a great question because actually in my field, we use the term early childhood educator because, over the years, people have realized with the science of brain development and lots of other advances that early learning and care actually go together, and especially in the early years when, if you think about your little one who's out there playing with others and you might think, they're just kind of hanging out and doing their thing, but actually that is super important for their learning and their development. And so for that reason, we use this term early childhood educator to really help people understand that this is a professional job, that the people who do this work are highly skilled in thinking about how do we help kids in their earliest years reach their full potential.
Caitlin, can you draw that out? I mean, what kinds of things are children learning at such a young age? I think folks who maybe don't have kids or aren't around kids very much, especially really young kids, don't realize the type of growth that's happening. Can you expand that? What kind of learning is happening at that young of an age?
Yeah, definitely. So all kinds of things, right? Sometimes when we talk about early education or early learning, people think, oh, you mean like learning your ABCs, right? And that's important for sure. But actually, kids are learning all kinds of things. They're soaking up everything about the world. They're learning how to interact with others. They're learning how to interact with other kids their own age, older kids, adults. What's really important for them is their interaction with adults. And so they're learning about, how do I regulate my emotions when I'm around others? How do I kind of process all this information? So it's actually really incredible. There's just been a ton of work really about how these first 5 years, especially, your brain is just kind of exploding with new neurons and things and really shaping who you're going to become.
And Caitlin, what kinds of places are we talking about when we talk about some of the things that you're saying? Daycares with a lot of kids, home cares, home daycare centers, or maybe just smaller ones or larger ones. Where does early childhood education take place? Where are we seeing these educators?
Yeah, in fact, it can be all of these places. So when we're talking about early care and education, we're talking about not just, the pre-kindergarten classes that you may be familiar with in your school, but they could be in what people call daycare, child care centers. That could be a, actual center. It could be in a church. It could be in a home. So really the whole range.
And Caitlin, childcare work doesn't pay well. We were hitting on that a little bit in the intro here. How does it compare with other careers in the U.S.?
So unfortunately, one of the key findings from our report is that despite how skilled these women, and they are mostly women, are who are doing this work, in fact, they're working in one of the worst paid jobs that you can have in this country. We ranked all the occupations in the U.S. by pay, and we found that 97% of other occupations pay more than working with the youngest kids.
Wow. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Caitlin McLean. She's the director of a program that studies child care employment. We're discussing why child care workers are paid so poorly. I want to hop into this a little bit more. Economists tell me that this is not supposed to happen this way, that if there's a high demand for something, then people should be paying a lot for that thing that they care so much about. Why is this not the case with child care work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So childcare is special. If you talk to economists, they may have used the words public good. This refers to things like public education, for example, where folks have realized this is a super important thing that our society needs. And it's something that can cost a lot. And a lot of folks just on their own may not be able to pay for it. And so for that reason, we actually need to kind of pool our resources as a community and invest in that service so that folks can use the service, but they're not paying directly for it, because it's just not the same as something like, buying a television or getting a haircut, where, there could be a range of quality, a range of access, and that's fine. It's not a big deal, versus when you're talking about something like education, where we understand that that's something that should be available to everyone.
And Caitlin, just building off of that, we're talking about, and you said it's mostly women who work in this field. So is this simply because this work is mostly done by women, or if childcare work was mostly done by men, is it plausible that people would be more willing to pay for it? What are your thoughts behind that?
I mean, I personally can't help but feel that if this workforce looked different, if it weren't mostly women and frankly many women of color, that we would value it differently. But because for so long we have undervalued women's time and we've associated things that women do with it being less important, I think there is still this kind of lingering cultural feeling like, oh, if it's care work, it's not skilled, it's not important, which of course is not true. And so you have kind of all these things going together at once, where there's an issue of not fully valuing the work, and then there's an issue of how we continue to ask parents to privately shoulder the burden of the cost, even though we know they can't afford it. And so all these things kind of come together to make it so the wages that programs can pay are not very high.
In your report, you talk a little bit about a values-based approach to child care worker compensation. Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, definitely. So, a lot of folks have realized that this is a problem and that we need to invest more public money into early care and education. And so in order to figure out, well, how much will that cost? Folks have been doing different models to think about, what could this look like? What will it cost? And so when we talk about a values-based approach, what we're saying is that's great, but make sure that you are thinking about what matters. And you're including in that ideal, situation that you're costing out the people who are doing this work. And so we talk about the need for a living wage, the need for a professional wage even, good working conditions, and that all of these things should also be included in thinking about what would it cost to provide high quality care.
And Caitlin, do federal or state governments need to intervene to increase payment for child care workers?
Yes, definitely. I think we saw that this is possible and that it can be done well when we had this sort of historic influx of federal money from the American Rescue Plan. And the good thing about that federal money is that it recognized this is not a regional issue. This is not something that just affects folks in Michigan, right? This is something that every child, every family needs across the country. So that's the reason for, federal investment. That said, states can also invest in early care and education. And that's one of the things that we saw with our report, that states across the nation were really looking at different ways to invest in early care and education programs and really help early childhood educators out.
I'm wondering kind of what needs to change in our politics. I think gender norms are changing, but they're changing, I guess, somewhat slowly, depending on the time scale that you consider it. And not like we've been talking about, not everybody values paying a lot for good child care. What needs to change? What kind of conversations do we need to have? What kind of organizing needs to have? What needs to change in order to make this a bigger thing? I mean, the child tax care credit was expanded, or the earned income tax care credit was expanded, and then it phased away from the federal government. What needs to change in order to keep some of these things around?
I think fundamentally we need to ask ourselves what's important. And if we really value children, if we value women and their time, then we'll consider that we've been asking, primarily women, and again, a lot of women of color, to really shoulder this burden for a long time. They've been basically subsidizing the system with essentially poverty-level wages. And so we need to think about, okay, is this the kind of society we want to live in? And if not, what can we do to make a change? And frankly, there's a lot that folks can do. If you're a parent, talk to your child care provider, understand what is it that they need, what's going on with them. And then when you're out and about, you can talk to folks. I talk to my Uber driver, I talk to my orthodontist. And then, of course, hold politicians accountable. Say, this is what we need. And if you're not providing it, I'm not voting for you.
Why? I only have about 30 seconds left, but I want you to make the case. Why does this matter? I mean, for a lot of people, they go out into the world and they're like, listen, I'm producing things, I'm consuming things, I'm interacting with a lot of people. Children, they have wonderful, beautiful minds, but they can't do that much, right? They're not able to do the things that adults are able to do, and so therefore we don't value them very much. Why is that wrong? Why is that the wrong impulse? And why is caring about children really important?
Yeah, people assume that this is just a parent's issue, but it actually affects all of us, right? I don't have kids, and yet I've devoted my life to this issue because the way that we treat kids in their earliest years sets them up for their lifelong journey. And so if we're thinking about things like, well, we need to pay for K-12, higher ed, we need to pay for our future workforce. All of that, if we took some of that money and invested it in our youngest kids, it would pay dividends.
Yeah. Caitlin McLean is the Director of Multi-State and International Programs at Berkeley's Center for the Study of Child Care Employment. Caitlin, thanks so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET-FM. You just heard from Sam Corey, the show's producer. I'm Tia Graham, and I too believe that children are the future.
Children are the future. Children are now. They're part of.
Ooh,
they're part of us.
Children are now.
Yeah, they're part of.
Children are now.
They're part of what we got going on right now. They're here.
I know they are here, and they are impacting us. They're going to impact our future as well. So it's important that we build up some resilient young folk out there. Looking at the forecast today, partly sunny with a high around 50 degrees. Wednesday, hump day, sunny with a high near 54. Thursday, sunny with a high around 61, and Friday, sunny skies with a high around 64 degrees. Looking pretty good for the end of the week. Sam, What's up next?
That's right. Coming up, it's the last day of Hispanic Heritage Month, and to celebrate, we'll speak with a man who has dedicated his career to improving the life of Latino residents here in Southeast Michigan.
Cuídame a Belén, mamá. Cuídame a Belén, mamá. Mamá, cuídame a Belén.
This is The Metro on 1019 WDET FM. Sam Corey across from me. I'm Tia Graham. And if you don't know who Ozzie Rivera is, you should. Rivera was instrumental in the creation of the Center for Latin American Studies, which was established in 1971. Rivera was born on the island of Puerto Rico, but is a lifelong Detroiter. His father was a musician, and in early life, Rivera became interested in both music and activism. Rivera teaches at Wayne State University and the University of Michigan. You can hear a little bit of the music playing there. That's Reconstruction, a band that he found himself, Rivera. He's a renowned drummer as well. And we'll also hear a little bit about the historical preservation that he's been working on, Detroit's Historic Designation Advisory Board member, and he also writes for El Centro newspaper. Ozzie Rivera, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Metro.
Well, thank you, Tia and Sam, for having me on. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Of course. And, you know, I love to start with the creation of the Center for Latin American Studies. It's changed its name up a little bit as well. But what were the times like in the late 60s, early 70s for Latin Detroiters? And what were some of the things that you were really fighting for then?
Well, just to clarify, I was one of the students in that first cohort, 1971. And at that time, it was called Latino en Marcha, which was supposed to be a one-year leadership training program established by New Detroit, which had just been established a couple years before that as a result of the uprising in 1967 in collaboration with LaSalle and Wayne State University. And at that point, there weren't that many Latinos in college, universities per se. And, you know, you're riding on the wave of the civil rights movement, both for African Americans and Latinos. And a number of students decided that we didn't want it just to be a one-year leadership program. So we kind of demonstrated and pressured the university, quite frankly, to make it a sustainable academic program. And 53 years later, the program's still in existence, and I happen to be one of the instructors that teaches Afro-Latino studies and history in the U.S. It's in collaboration with African American studies. So it's 53 years of some kind of connection to Wayne State. And back then, I mean, you have to understand Latinos generally were an afterthought, if at all. So that would be the general conditions.
And Ozzie, 50 plus years, like you said, and I think about, once again, just this young college student who just wanted to make an impact, wanted to make a change, yet 53 years later, you're still making that impact and you're still making that change. And, you talked about New Detroit Inc., which we spoke with them yesterday, actually, about their conference happening this Thursday. And that creation of New Detroit Inc., and then you have the creation of the center at Wayne State University. Talk about equity, of course, in the city of Detroit. What were the things that you all were fighting for, especially for the Latin community, Latino community, in terms of equity? What did that look like?
Well, I mean, there's some broad brushes to discuss in terms of just acknowledgement and civil rights, but specifically as it related to the Latino community in Detroit, there were issues with the lack of bilingual education. Actually, many students were funneled into special ed classes only because they spoke Spanish. So LaSalle, the same agency that helped establish the Center for Latino Studies, back then it was called Latino Marcha, and then later on Chicano Boricua Studies, also put in a successful lawsuit against the Detroit public school system for funneling, directing Spanish-speaking students. And some of them weren't even Spanish-speaking. They were put in special rooms. Some would say some closets. And so you had to fight for bilingual education and against standardization or delegitimizing Latin students.
And Ozzie, that was happening.
legacy,
I'm sorry, that was happening just because you didn't have culturally competent teachers, or was it more malicious than that? Was it more ignorant, or was it more malicious?
Well, the way to answer is to look at it is in terms of a national context. What was happening in Detroit at that time was happening throughout the whole country. So I would say it was a combination of both outright racism and a lack of cultural competence. But more important than that, it was a lack of bilingual education. And so, the Civil Rights Act of the mid-'70s, I forget exactly which one, actually guaranteed the right to a language. A lot of people don't talk about that a fundamental piece of civil rights legislation, in addition to fight against discrimination against ethnicity, skin color, and nationality, was around language issues. So, we were fighting for things, not so much myself, but colleagues were fighting for things that were already written into the law.
And Ozzie, once again, with the work that you've been able to do in Southeast Michigan and Detroit and in Michigan in general, what have you noticed in terms of progress when you talk about that time versus what we see today? What progress have you seen?
I hate to say it. There has been progress, but I hate to say that in some ways we've actually gone back. Demonizing Latins, in particular because of the immigration issues, not new. A lot of people don't know that in the 30s, not only in Detroit, but throughout the country, many Latinos were actually deported, mainly Mexicans and Mexican Americans, back to Mexico. At that time, immigrants were being blamed for the Great Depression. And a lot of people don't realize that it is estimated that 60% of the Latinos, Mexican Americans primarily, who were deported to Mexico were actually U.S. citizens. They were Mexican Americans, long roots in Texas and California, Arizona, even up north. And so think about what's happening now, the demagoguery that's being pushed. But on the other hand, the achievements is that a whole bunch of cadre, many young Latinos who are now elders, were trained in the civil rights movement and act in various activities, whether it was a bilingual rights, education rights, ethnic studies, leadership positions in a multitude of organizations, folks becoming lawyers, the whole gamut. In Detroit specifically, let me go back to the deportation piece. A lot of people don't realize that there was an estimated up to 15,000 Latinos, mainly Mexicans, and notice I said Mexican Americans, in the early 30s. It is estimated 12,500 to 13,000 were deported or repatriated during that period. So, that had a big impact on the stability of Latin American community. It wasn't until after World War II that you had this growing community again. Imagine if those folks had not been deported when Detroit was in its prime. Detroit was growing in the 20s and 30s, leaps and bounds, yet a key part of that community was basically banished. And the use of the word banished is legit because that's actually what happened.
And Ozzie, we're going to come right back to you. We're going to go take a short break. And once again, we'll return to our conversation with Ozzie Rivera, learning a little bit more about the history of Latinos here in the city of Detroit. You all stay right there.
And the
If you are just joining us on the Metro on 101.9 WDET-FM, we're chatting with longtime Detroiter activist, educator, and musician Ozzie Rivera. Ozzie has dedicated his life to uplifting the Latino communities here in Southwest Detroit and in Michigan. And that was Ozzie performing live at the 2022 Concert of Colors with Reconstruction. And when I listen to that, I just feel all of the honestly, I feel my ancestral drums coming out as well inside of me. So get into the history of the music there and how it connects different cultures, especially when we talk about things that were happening during the 19th century slavery. Let's just get to that, the slavery that was happening and how all those cultures came together to connect to create the music that we hear today.
Well, Latin America is made up of 20-some different countries. So
wow.
the diversity and variety of musical styles and the way that African influence, the Native American, European influence is played out in different countries. I teach a course, and I'm just scratching the surface on that. But what you just heard there was an Afro-Puerto Rican tradition that goes back almost 500 years. And it's really a blend of West African rhythms, Spanish-speaking, but also a little Haitian influence in there, too. And it was about building community. Bomba tradition is not just music and drumming and singing and chanting to be performed in front of an audience, but actually the traditional bomba ceremonies can last for 20, 30 hours back in the day, obviously, during times of slavery, and ever since, you didn't have TV or lights or whatever. So the communities, the coastal villages, and the sugarcane plantation areas would, on the weekends, have these bomba sessions that could go on, like I said, for 20, 30, 40 hours nonstop, where members of the community got together and danced and sang, and every weekend. And so it's part of our heritage. What's real interesting, for a while, I would say in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s even, that tradition was dying out because it was actually considered folkloric, and it is, but it was relegated to small areas. It kind of had died out. But what's interesting in the last 20, 30 years in particular, it's shown a rebirth as young people from the island and Puerto Ricans that are dispersed throughout the United States and even the world have brought this tradition back. And almost every single community that you have a Puerto Rican community in, significant, you have bomba circles, and young people are exploring this as a way of reaffirmation, retouching themselves with their ancestral roots, and as a cultural reaffirmation, but also resistance. And so if you follow the news about the situations on the island, bomba circles are fundamental to a lot of the demonstrations that you see. But at the same time, it's part of everyday weekend. It's a broad stroke, but I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, of course you did, Ozzie. That was beautiful history lesson there, and I'm going to ask you more history questions because that's what we're going to do right now. There was a little blurb that I read. I believe you did the you work with Marcus Lyon. You did the Detroiters story, the ancestral story. I remember reading that in the book. It's a beautiful book actually by Marcus Lyon, the UK journalist. But so you talked a little bit about the beginning of Guadalupe, which is December 12th, celebrating the festivals there. Why is it important to remember as Latinos the connection to the Native American heritage as well? Yeah,
and the Virgen de Guadalupe is a Mexican-American religious ceremony that's been brought about by the Catholic Church, but it has its Native American roots in the sense that, when the Spanish conquered Mexico and Central America, they originally had a hard time converting the formerly independent folks to Catholicism. And Virgen de Guadalupe was, the story goes, the Virgin Mary coming to an indigenous peasant named Juan Diego. But if you look at the icon itself, she is a dark-skinned, native-looking Mary. And that became part of the tradition that kind of helped to make Mexico a Catholic country. But it's paying homage to its Native American heritage. And it's probably the biggest religious ceremony for Mexicans and Mexican Americans. You'll find it, the symbol, the icon, on many non-religious movements. For example, the United Farm Workers, besides the Aztec eagle, would have the Virgen Guadalupe often at the lead of their marches. So it's kind of what is called a mestizo, or a blend of different cultures, but still paying a homage to the Native American tradition. And again, it's probably the biggest Mexican religious holiday.
And Ozzie, the preservation of history is important to you. Clearly, you teach it. You make sure that new generations and all people know about the history of Latinos, but just the history of Latinos here in Detroit. So you spoke with Ralph Valdez, who is a WDET employee, longtime native Detroiter as well. And you wrote about his family's journey from Michoacan? Yes, Michoacan to Michigan. Excited about that one. Why is it important to tell these stories of migration? I actually had time to sit down with Ralph and hear this story and really, really get immersed in it. It's a fascinating story about just finding your roots, and they found their space and place in Detroit. So if you can talk about the importance of preserving these stories of migration, especially as we talk about the migration to Detroit.
Well, there has been a Latino community well over 100 years in Detroit. Yet the narrative, or the perception, maybe better said, is that the Latino community is a relatively new community. And just summing up Ralph's story, it is indicative of many other Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Notice I said Mexican Americans, yes, because with the Mexican-American War, the border crossed Mexico because Mexico lost half of its territory to the United States. So we have to understand that Mexican and indigenous people were already on that land that we call the Southwest. So well over 100 years ago, you had two sizable Latino communities come independently of each other. One was the story of Ralph's family, where many of them came to work in the Thumb area in the sugar beet industry. Many of them also came to start working in the Ford plants, particularly the Highland Park plant. And this goes back to 1918, which is the exact year that Ralph's family came. But interesting enough, a separate wave of mainly black Puerto Ricans, Afro-Puerto Rican males, ended up in Detroit the same year, because in 1917, the U.S. made Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens. But what was interesting, many of them ended up going to fight in World War I, mainly as part of black segregated units, including the Harlem Hellfighters, the unit that introduced jazz to Europe with Jim Reese, Europe Reese, and but many of them went to build ships for the war effort in New Orleans. And the group of Puerto Ricans that came to Detroit in 1918 came to build ships. And after the war ended, not all of them returned to the island. They spread out throughout the United States. And I got to interview about 6 or 7 elders who were in their 80s in the 1971, 72. I got to interview them because my father's family knew quite a few of them, because most of them were from the southern part of the island where I was born. And I sat down with them, and they told me the story that for the most part, they didn't return back to Puerto Rico to live. And they were single men, black Puerto Ricans, who ended up marrying into the African-American community. And the reason why they settled in Detroit, collectively speaking, is though colorism and racism exist throughout Latin America. Let's be honest about that. They weren't used to Jim Crowism that they experienced once they left New Orleans and started going up the South. And they just basically told me, oh, hell no. And they kept moving north. A number of them went to New York, and they said, nah, that's too crazy, too big of a city. And that's where about 100 of them ended up settling in what was then the beginning years of the Black Bottom neighborhood. They lived within the actual core area of Black Bottom, but also on the western edge, more closer to Wayne State, Mac, and Woodward area, just east of that. So, and as I already talked about the mass deportation, so you get this story really that has to be told that Latinos have been here for many, many generations and contributing to the life of Detroit area.
Ozzie Rivera is a native Detroiter, historian, and activist. Also, just want to throw out there the most recent recipient of the Clement Kern Award for Social Impact from My Side, a community impact network. Want to say congratulations to you for that award.
Thank you.
You're very welcome, and thank you for joining us on the Metro.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate this opportunity.
Coming up, an event exploring our democracy is taking place tomorrow at Michigan State. We'll speak with an award-winning journalist and a panelist at the event next.
It is the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Sam Corey. There are a lot of issues voters care about, but depending on your party, voter priorities are very different. According to Gallup polling, Republicans care most about the economy. Democrats, by contrast, care most about the fate of our democracy, their health care, and abortion access. We're less than a month away from the presidential election, and that leaves us wondering what might turn out the most votes for either party, and what will excite swing voters who may determine the election. Joining us to discuss these things is Tim Alberta. Tim is an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and staff writer for The Atlantic. He's covered politics with a close eye on both the white evangelical Christian movement in this country and the shifts happening in the Republican Party. He will also be speaking at an event called Democracy at a Crossroads tomorrow at 4:30 on Michigan State University's campus. To discuss the election, the issues on voters' minds, and the state of our democracy, we have Tim here. Tim, welcome to the Metro.
Hey, good morning.
Yeah, it's great to have you on here. It's a really important time. Jumping in, former President Donald Trump has flouted democratic norms, and he's tried to spur an insurrection on January 6, 2021, of course. Republican voters, I should say, don't seem to care that much about democracy. What might Trump's anti-democratic tendencies mean for swing voters in this election? What are the issues that might turn them out?
Well, it's an interesting question because we've now had 3.5 years to collect and analyze a lot of data around this question of January 6th and Trump's assault on our democratic institutions, and to what degree, if at all, it moves the needle with voters beyond just the voters in the Democratic base who were never going to vote for Trump anyway. And I think, at best, we can see that it matters sort of marginally to independent voters, to moderates, to persuadables. But I think that has to be considered in the context of this election cycle really being one where the universe of truly persuadable voters is smaller than it's ever been. And that's one of the few points of consensus between both parties at this point. If you were to talk to the folks in charge of the Trump operation, the folks in charge of the Harris operation, they would tell you essentially the same thing, which is that this is trench warfare, that they're fighting over, 150,000 voters across 15 counties or so in the final weeks of this election. And so the question really becomes, for those voters, overwhelmingly these persuadable voters being affluent, college-educated women in the suburbs outside of Detroit and Milwaukee and Philadelphia and Phoenix and Vegas and Atlanta, you're trying to understand, you're trying to parse out, what role does this question of democracy play in those voters' decisions? And it's just not clear that it's going to play much of a role, if any. We do see a lot of data on economics informing those votes, on abortion informing those votes, on immigration and questions of crime and safety informing those votes. But there's just really not much evidence at all to suggest that one way or another they're going to be swayed by this messaging around the health and sustainability of our democracy.
Yeah, so inflation, immigration, crime to a certain degree, these are the things that persuadables are looking at. In 2022, you did a big story for The Atlantic about how Democrats are losing Hispanic voters across the South and Southwest. You do a lot of reporting on a lot of different things in politics, Tim, but to the best of your understanding, is that still true?
Yeah, it is. And I think, part of what I was examining in that piece was the sort of cultural disconnect where the sort of progressive wing of the Democratic Party has begun to antagonize not just the white working class, but really sort of the multiracial working class, especially when it comes to men. So I think what you're seeing in this election is sort of a continuation and acceleration of that trend, certainly among Latino men and younger Latino men, like under 40 years old. You're seeing probably the biggest break towards Republicans that we've seen, at least in the modern history of polling. And then I think that there are indications that Republicans are going to win a bigger share of black men than they've won in the modern history of exit polling, at least. So there's certainly warning signs here for the Democratic Party, because if in fact we have another race that's at the margins of 20 or 30,000 votes in one state, 20 or 30,000 votes in another state, which is what we had both in 16 and in 20, Kamala Harris the math is not going to work ultimately if she is losing some really significant chunk of black voters in Wayne County, or for that matter, Latino voters in Maricopa County out in Arizona. These margins are just too small. And so obviously the Democratic Party sees this, and I think that's part of the reason why they are sort of going into overdrive, focusing even more so on a lot of these affluent, college-educated white women in these suburbs who they believe, if they break historically in the other direction, could actually compensate for those losses.
And Tim, why is this true that we're seeing men moving toward the Republican Party, especially when you talked about black male voters and Latino male voters? What are some of the things and some of the variables there that you're seeing pushing them towards the Republican Party?
I think maybe the single biggest variable here is something kind of new and something sort of intangible, and that is just a sort of we talk a lot about identity politics, and that's typically categorized around race or nationality or gender identity. But I think that there's a sort of machismo that is kind of animating today's Republican Party in new and unique ways. And I think we see that over the past few months. We've seen former President Trump really deliberately inserting himself into all of these sort of bro podcasts, into UFC fights, into college football games, like really going after, again, not just the sort of traditional white male voter, but like really trying to expand the electorate and expand the Republican coalition to reach a lot of young, multiracial, working class. This is what they're envisioning anyway, this sort of multiracial working class coalition built around a lot of men who either had sat out previous elections or had voted Democratic. But these young men, according to the sort of Trump theory of the case, is that they feel estranged, sort of culturally estranged from a Democratic Party that is not as focused on their issues as they would like them to be. And whether that's real or not, this is a sort of perception is reality thing. And I think both parties now are recognizing that for whatever enormous advantage that the Harris campaign has among women, it ultimately may not mean that much if she loses even more lopsidedly among male voters. And that's sort of the calculus that we're seeing both campaigns pay attention to here in the closing weeks.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with journalist Tim Alberta. We're discussing an event his publication, The Atlantic, is hosting at Michigan State University tomorrow called Democracy at a Crossroads. Tim will be a panelist at that event. It's happening ahead of the presidential election. Tim, I want to talk to you a little bit about the recent profile you did of Republican Senator Mike Lee out of Utah. He was a man who's known for his integrity. He had opposed Donald Trump on the grounds that he was unethical and authoritarian, and then he gradually switched to Trump's side. I'm wondering what Lee's tale is supposed to tell us. Is it that this is what happens to people who get too close to power? You know, they're more likely to get corrupted. Does it show how Trump has essentially cannibalized the Republican Party and has gotten people to come to his side, even those who otherwise disagree with him? What are we supposed to take away from this story?
Well, those are pretty good takeaways to start. You probably said it better than I could. Yeah, look, I mean, I think that there's sort of a cautionary tale here. It's certainly universal to our politics as a general matter. We see people become corrupted. We see people sort of lose sight of their principles and sort of begin to compromise themselves in some really damning and heartbreaking ways. And certainly that's the case here with Senator Mike Lee. But I obviously, it does go more specifically to the heart of this current moment in Republican politics, where in order to maintain any influence, any power or any proximity to power in today's GOP, you have to toe the line. You have to stand and salute. There can be no daylight between you and Donald Trump. And what we've seen over the past, 6 or 7, 8 years now is sort of an endless procession of these really kind of comical examples of this, of people who had once spoken the truth about Donald Trump and who then sort of come to realize that unless they want their career to be over, then they'd better shape up and sing a different tune. I think the thing that's so remarkable about Mike Lee is that this is arguably more than any other Republican. This is the guy who led the charge to stop Trump back in 2016. He literally tried to rewrite the rules of the party so that Trump could not be nominated for the presidency. And he talked about Trump being an authoritarian and the threat that he posed to the Constitution. And so now here he is, 8 years later, not only having sort of walked all of that back, but having defended all of the actions leading up to January 6th.
I appreciate that. I only got 20 seconds left here, but I just, that's about all we got for the time. Tim Alberta is an award-winning journalist at The Atlantic. He will be at the event tomorrow, Democracy at the Crossroads event, which is happening at the Wharton Center for Performing Arts at Michigan State University from 4:30 to 6:30. Tim, I want so much more time. Thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Yeah, you bet, guys. Thanks.
And that's the Metro. For Tuesday, October 15th, you can listen to recent episodes online at WDET.org. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. The show is also on YouTube if you like listening that way.
The show is produced by me, Sam Corey, Tia Graham, David Lyons, and Jack Philbrandt with support from Dorothy Jones. Our engineer is Nate Bender, music by Sam Bobian and Will Sessions.
The Metro is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. If you like what you hear and you want to support the Metro, consider becoming a member at WDET.org/donate.
This is WDET, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. See you tomorrow.